This is obviously a hot topic that a lot of people are interested in, and 20 minutes is not a lot of time in which to get through it all. So I want to cut straight to the chase. This is how neural machine translation works. It's fairly straightforward. Language on one side goes into another language over there. So sit back and relax. That's not what I'm going to cover today. There are people in much better position to explain in great technical detail how this exactly works. I'm going to cover more the impact that it's going to have on the industry, on you as the buyer of translation technology, as the user of translation technology, as service providers. So, like I said, not going to cover how it works, but I'm going to try and give you a sense of what's the fuss all about. Why is this such a big deal? I'm going to try and answer the question what neural machine translation is, but again, not from the technical perspective, more from the impact and the significance perspective. I'm going to look at what the status of it is as of today, and answer the question, is it really as good as people are saying it is? And then finally, answer the question as to what does this all mean for the industry. But before I begin, I want to be a bit of a party pooper. There's been a lot of talk about neural machine translation, a lot of hype, and I can imagine that looking in from the outside without understanding exactly what's going on, it's very difficult to separate the hype from reality. There's been a lot of articles about it, mainstream coverage, a lot of it's been embellished to a significant extent, a lot of press releases. To give you an example of this, so this all kind of kicked off in September last year when Google published their paper on archive as Florian introduced, and it was a well-written 23-page academic technical report describing the background art, the methodology, the evaluations, and one line they had in their conclusion, and the emphasis is my own here, is that listen to how conservatively and academically this is couched. In some cases, human and Google neural machine translations are nearly indistinguishable on the relatively simplistic and isolated sentences sampled from Wikipedia and news articles for this experiment. And this is how it was reported in news articles, TechCrunch, things like that. Humans are... You guys did a little bit of a better job. But essentially, humans are gone, machines are taken over, and this was the reaction of machine translation developers around the world. This was not the first time this has happened. No joke, I got 24 emails the next day saying, have you seen this? Can you do this? What does this mean? There's been a history of false dawns with machine translation, people promising the world and then it ultimately not delivering, people shying away from it then for 3-4 years before they come back. So I'm trying to get in at the start here and try to manage expectations a little bit. I'm not trying to burst any bubbles. I just want to kind of rein things back into reality a little bit and bring people back down to earth with the reality of the situation. So I thought, what better way to start than with a bombastic, sensationalist question like neural machine translation, is it evolution or revolutionary? Because I've seen this framed in this context before. And I think to answer this, we need to give it some historical context. So we've seen a lot of timelines and things like that recently. So I'm going to give the briefest history of machine translation you've ever seen. It's a relatively young technology. All technology is quite young, but it started back in the mid-1950s in a collaboration between Georgetown University and IBM, who were working on Russian to English translation. I'll give you any guess as to why they were interested in Russian translation at the time. And I think their test set... Yeah, I think their test set comprised of a dozen sentences maybe, and it worked pretty well on those dozen sentences. And then we had our first instance of the technical report from this study saying we expect the automated translation problem to be solved within 2 to 4 years. So this spawned a lot of investment into this type of research across the US. Which went on until around 1966 when the ALPAC report was published, which basically said, okay, this hasn't worked. This is terrible, this technology is not practicable. And essentially the plug was pulled on most of the funding. And it was kind of in the doldrums for 15 to 20 years until we had some success cases. So there was a big project funded across Europe called Eurotra, which actually ended up being the start of most of the research groups in Europe that work on machine translation. And there was also a successful case in France called Meteo, where they were translating weather reports between French and English, which is an easier task because there's only so many ways you can describe the weather, even if you're from Ireland like myself. And so what these approaches all had in common is that they were based on what we call rule-based machine translation. So this is the idea of you have linguistic rules that say for two particular languages how you need to convert to translate from one to the other, and then use dictionaries to actually translate the words. So what we had in the early 90s was our first paradigm shift from rule-based to data-driven statistical approaches. So again, we had people from IBM took approaches to speech and language processing and try to apply them to machine translation. So this is the notion of taking massive amounts of data and learning how to translate from it. And so that's how we progressed pretty much for the last 20, 25 years, building those models from doing word-for-word translation to phrase-to-phrase translation, incorporating bits of linguistic information on top of them. And then only in the last couple of years have we had our second paradigm shift to what we call neural machine translation. And I guess the concepts behind neural machine translation aren't actually new. Neural networks have been around for a long time. People have considered them for machine translation before, but I guess the challenge was that hardware wasn't up to the task. And so that's what's kind of changed, and that's why we've had this paradigm shift. And to give the most layman description of the difference between neural machine translation and existing approaches like statistical, like I said, statistical went from maybe translating word for word, and then it tried to expand that from phrase to phrase. Whereas neural networks give machine translation the capability to consider more context, look at the whole sentence, look at more than the sentence, the paragraph, and that's what can lead to some of the more fluent output for more challenging languages that we've seen. So this has only come about in the last, I think Florian showed the statistics from arXiv that this was a fringe research topic back in 2014. People weren't studying it, and so why is there so much fuss about it? So to give you some context, I guess, if we look at this bar of machine translation quality, this was the initial splash that statistical machine translation made in terms of performance. It's this good. And so then we spent 20 plus years making incremental improvements, trying things for certain use cases, for certain languages, all those different things, and bumping up the quality bit by bit. And to be honest, in the last 2-3 years, it's been very incremental. In order to kind of get little improvements in quality, you really have to focus on specific use cases. So what happened when people first started to try neural machine translation is it made this initial splash in terms of quality. So people thought, wow, that's pretty good. We're looking at some cases where we've just taken this technology off the shelf, out of the box, and in some cases it's nearly as good, if not better, than this technology that we've been working on for 20 years. And so this is where the excitement is coming from. We're only about here in terms of development with neural machine translation. Sorry. And this bit kind of up here where the question mark is where the excitement is coming from. We're completely at the very tippy top of a hype cycle. We don't know how far we can get up this bar. We don't know how long it's going to take, but that's kind of where the excitement is coming from. And so if I try to answer the question, what is neural machine translation? It's exciting for that exact reason. We have runway now. We have stuff to try. We don't have to keep tweaking things to try and fix little mistakes. All of a sudden, we're making orders of magnitude of improvement in some cases than others. So there's kind of light at the end of the tunnel from a technology perspective, and that's what's pretty exciting. And it certainly is the future. This is the way that most people who are researching on machine translation are doing it now. Yes, there will still be many cases where existing statistical approaches, even rule-based, is still around. And they're going to run in parallel, but certainly neural machine translation is the future, and it's the way people are going to continue to develop machine translation. That being said, it is ultimately just another type of machine translation, right? So it's not doing anything magical. It's not curing diseases. It's still just machine translation. So at the end of the day, we're going to have the same user interfaces, the same integrations, some of the same problems that we've had in the past, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But ultimately, the crux of the matter is we might have that with better quality translations. I think it's important to say what neural machine translation is not at this stage. And this is very important. It's not a replacement for human translators. And I think this is a conversation that needs to be completely reframed, because this is how it's often couched, particularly in the media when it's discussed that, oh, it's nearly as good as humans. They're complementary technologies. There are cases where human translation is the only viable option. There are cases where machine translation is the only viable option, massive volumes of content that need to be turned around in a short space of time. And they're complementary technologies. Machine translation can be used to assist the human translation process. And I know Spence is going to talk about things like that a little bit later on. So I think this is quite important to reframe this conversation, not as a competition, but as something complementary. And it's also not a silver bullet. So it's not a technology that's going to come in and completely wipe out the existing approaches to machine translation. They're going to run in parallel. There are going to be ways that they can combine. If we look at some of the evaluations and the performance to date, it's not better than existing approaches at everything. It is at some things, but not in all cases. So it's not going to be that silver bullet that's going to come in and completely sweep the decks. So with that being said, where are we today as of May 9th, 2017 in terms of neural machine translation? So it's still very much being driven through academia. Like I said earlier on, it's still a very early stage topic. In 2014, I think the actual number is something like 2% of all papers published in 2014 were on neural machine translation. Then it went up to like 65% of all papers in the next year. That's really early. 2 years is not a long time in research. If you think about how long it takes to kind of think of an idea, do the experiments, fail at some things, get other things right, do the evaluations, write the paper, that can take 6 months. So we haven't really had a lot of cycles of research on neural machine translation yet. It's still language independent. So, people have written, some of the leading minds in the machine translation field have written theses on things as specific as the translation of German noun phrases or prepositional phrases in Chinese. And all research on neural machine translation is still language independent. It's just on how the core concepts actually work. And then still, a lot of the fundamental practical considerations haven't yet been addressed. You mentioned a great word in your talk, industry proof. And I think that's something that's still up for discussion with neural machine translation as to how fully industry proof it is. And so if we look at the state of it in industry, all we have at the moment are generic applications, the likes of Google Translate, Microsoft Translator. And that's because there's actually limited flexibility for customization. So a lot of the value that providers of machine translation like ourselves add is that we can customize it for a specific use case or a specific client and their terminology and things like that. And with neural machine translation, we don't have that same flexibility yet. And then there are obviously significant hurdles for cost-effective, scalable, industry-proof production. So like I said, the only reason that neural machine translation has even come on board in the last number of years is because technology has caught up. But to give you an example, on this MacBook, I could build a statistical machine translation system in about 6 hours, say. To build the equivalent system with a neural machine translation engine, it would take at least a week, maybe 2, and I would need graphical processor units, which are, significantly more expensive than a CPU that you'll find in a machine like this. So there are issues that we're going to face from a production perspective with neural machine translation. But still, the output can be insanely fluent, which is why people are so interested in trying to overcome these hurdles as quickly as possible. I mentioned earlier there's been 20 years worth of research in statistical MT. That's going to be really condensed because there's kind of a land grab with neural machine translation research as to who can do what and how quickly they can do it. So to answer the question, is it really that good? Is it as good as everybody's saying? And the answer is it can be. But like with many things around machine translation, it depends. So let's look at some of the evaluations that you might have come across or that you might be reading in whatever kind of channels you read. Most of them have been anecdotal. Like, yeah, it looks better. Wow, that looks really cool. Wow, it reads so fluent. And that's not analyzed with any knowledge of the source. So that's somebody reading some English output that was translated maybe from Swahili, and you're reading it and you're saying, this looks great, but you don't actually know if it's a good translation. So most of the evaluations that you'll see from a mainstream perspective are anecdotal, but there is a lot of research going on in academia. And the findings are that generally neural machine translation is comparable than existing approaches, and in some cases, it's quite a lot better. And we're seeing where it's better is for languages that have been traditionally particularly challenging for machine translation. So if we look at language pairs like English to Korean or English to Japanese or Arabic, languages where there's quite a lot of like linguistic divergence. The word order is quite different. The grammar is quite different. Because the statistical approaches are only looking at kind of word by word or kind of a few words by a few words, it often loses context, and that's where you get that kind of garbled machine translation output at times. But neural machine translation is able to take in more context. So in many cases, it's able to produce more fluent output. However, we're also learning where it's not good. And so certain things we've seen are that it can fall over very badly on long sentences, or if the data that the neural machine translation is trained on is different than the content that you're translating, then it's going to produce some pretty weird results. So there haven't been a lot of practical evaluations around neural machine translation yet, but I'm going to touch on two very briefly. So WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Office, have a lot of data for intellectual property patent information, and they built over 30 neural machine translation systems. And what we saw in reverse order, the performance was comparable to their existing statistical machine translation systems for many languages. So for the easier languages like French or Spanish and English, the performance was the same, but they saw stark improvements for languages like Chinese and Arabic. And in my own company, Iconic, obviously it's in our interest to see where we can take a technology like this and get it into our production workflows as soon as possible. In the short term, where can this help us the most? So we do a lot of work for Chinese to English machine translation for patents, patent information, chemical information. So we did a practical comparison with our existing mature production systems and neural machine translation systems as well. And what we saw were mixed results, which is not what you always want to see, but in a sense, it was encouraging that we didn't take this thing off the shelf and all of a sudden it was better than the stuff that we've been working on for a decade. So. But what we did see was clear strengths and weaknesses emerging of the technology on the content that we work on. So, like I said, we saw that it worked and it was good, but it wasn't a silver bullet in terms of the content that we were translating. So if we look at, we're translating patent titles and abstracts, where the titles are short sentences, on average 7 to 8 words in length. The neural machine translation system was better than our existing production systems, more so. But once we looked at the longer sentences in the abstract, more kind of complex technical language, I think the average sentence length was over 40 words. That's when the quality started to fall off a cliff a little bit with the neural system. So what we saw in terms of the relative strengths and weaknesses, the existing production systems were much better at producing correct terminology because we actually have the ability to apply terminology directly. It was actually much better at producing error-free output. So I think in 25% of the cases, our systems were producing translations with no errors in them at all. And this is because we have processes that we call automatic post-editing, that if we know the types of errors it makes, we can actually fix them automatically if they happen in a consistent way. But it still failed in the traditional ways that it tends to fail with sentence structure, just that kind of weird machine translation ease style language. And so looking at the pros and cons of the neural output, it was much better at the fluency. The sentences and the translations just read a little bit more nicely. And things like agreement, grammatical agreement between gender and number and things were better. But it was making weird mistakes where it was just omitting parts of the translation. So we might have had a 30-word Chinese sentence and we got 6 words of translation in English. And from a production perspective, that's problematic. I could have 95% really good translations, but then if 5 of the sentences, don't get a translation, that's a problem for us. So I guess that's where it is. We're starting to get a clearer picture as to what it's good at, what it's not good at. And so it's producing a lot of new opportunities, but with these new opportunities, we're seeing new types of challenges that are maybe challenges that we didn't have before or challenges that we fixed before and we have to fix again. So like I touched on, neural machine translation is back to being a bit of a black box. It's producing errors. We don't exactly know why it's producing a lot of the errors. And that's what the research is trying to understand what's going on a little bit inside the black box. We still have issues in terms of being able to customize the translation. So I guess a lot of the value that we will add with statistical machine translation, say, is if it's producing some poor output, we know 30 or 40 different places in our models that we can look to see what the source of that error is. And with neural machine translation, we don't have that many places that we can look at. So we don't have that much flexibility to do what we want to do. And then, like I mentioned before, production is still going to be an issue because, if you read, I think there was an Economist article about how Google ended up moving from statistical to neural machine translation and the scale of the investment that they had to do in order to be able to to do what they do, and it was insane. And so that's an issue that we're all going to face when we want to put neural machine translation into production. So there's some new challenges that we have to solve, but there are some old challenges that still haven't gone away. So we still need data. If any of you have ever worked with a machine translation provider before, you've probably heard them ask you, do you have data, translation memories, glossaries, and things like that to train the systems? They're still needed for neural machine translation. You could argue they're needed more than ever because it's a data-hungry process. So that's not gone away. It's still machine translation. It's still not perfect, so we still have to do evaluation. We still have to quantify quality somehow. When it's not perfect, how do we quantify it as to whether it's fit for purpose for our use case? And then pricing. So especially if we're talking about pricing for post-edited machine translation, that's a challenge that we'll all have that's still not going to go away. Is, okay, yes, the machine translation is a little bit better. How does that impact how we charge our clients, how we pay the translators? So old challenges and new challenges. And I guess to wrap up, what does this all mean for the future? So I think in the short term, it just means we need to do a little bit more research, which is just going to take a little bit of time. So I guess that would be one thing that I would preach is let's just take a little bit of time. Let's not kind of get a bit too excited about what we're going to be able to do right now. That a lot of what we need to find out is still kind of still a research topic. But what it's certainly going to do, and one of the biggest impacts it's going to have in the short term, is it's going to increase the effectiveness and the use cases that are suitable for generic machine translation. So if you look at, say, Google Translate, which was here in terms of quality, there are certain use cases that it was good for. But then above that quality range, we have to customize and we have to invest in more machine translation technology. What Neural does is raises this bar to here. So now all of a sudden there are more use cases that are acceptable for neural machine translation. And I guess that's the biggest impact that Google and more generic neural machine translation is going to have in the short term. You might try something and say, oh wow, it never worked for me for Japanese before, and now all of a sudden it's good enough. A little bit longer term, over the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to see more emerging use cases. Generally speaking, we're just going to get more clarity on where neural machine translation is going to have an impact, where it's going to be useful, where we're still going to have to do deeper customization and things like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to see new types of hybrid systems. So I talked already about rule-based systems, and when statistical systems came in, rule-based didn't go away. There are still companies that develop hybrid rule-based and statistical systems, and I would say that from a production perspective, that's still the most prominent combination of technologies that are out there. And again, with neural, it's just come in, we're still just here. So we're going to see new types of hybrid systems. Is that going to be neural systems that have statistical post-editing or rule-based post-editing? Are they going to be statistical systems with neural post-editing? That's quite a hot research topic. We don't quite know yet, so we're going to get more clarity on this over the next 2 to 5 years. After that, who knows? We're getting into a bit of a blue sky space, but there have been papers about things like zero-shot translation, where you essentially just have one giant machine translation system that translates between any particular language. Who knows whether that will ever come to fruition, but it certainly makes for a nice story. So I guess to wrap it up, I think while we need to be wary about over-exuberance about machine translation and neural machine translation specifically, there's certainly reason for the optimism. And I think over time, you're only going to see further improvements in quality. I would say keep an eye on the news later on today. I know there's another big company are going to do a big announcement about their neural machine translation platform and the improvements that it's got over existing approaches. And I think this is a trend that we're going to see over the next couple of years still. But I would just preach, give it a little bit of time. Thank you very much.